Hello, I'm your host Luay Al-Jundi, and you are watching the Arabic Hour. On today's program, we will continue our coverage of the conference One State for Palestine, Israel, a country for all its citizens. This week, we will continue our coverage of One State for Palestine, Israel, a country for all its citizens, a conference sponsored by the Trans-Arab Research Institute, TARI, and the William Joyner Center for the Study of War and Social Consequences of the University of Massachusetts. Last week, we heard part of the conference's first panel, Is the Two-State Solution Feasible? We will complete our coverage of that first panel with the conclusion of Professor Naseer Aruri's presentation. Is the two-state settlement still viable? An overall assessment of the present situation. We will also begin panel 2, a historic settlement in harmony with the Jewish and Palestinian ethos, with speakers Professor Oren Ben-Dor and Professor Mark Ellis. And now, the remainder of Professor Naseer Aruri's presentation on the two-state solution. Professor Aruri is a Chancellor Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. He has published 9 books including The Dishonest Broker, The Obstruction of Peace, The U.S., Israel, and the Palestinians, Jordan, a study in political development, and Palestine and the Palestinians, a social and political history, with Samih Farsoon. He is also a founder and current president of the Trans-Arab Research Institute, TARI.
It is completely clear that the only two choices the Israeli political system has generated for the Palestinians are apartheid or ethnic cleansing, transfer. Apartheid is the Enlightened Labour Party's program, as in the Alone Plan or the Oslo Plan, while the other pole is advocating slow suffocation of the Palestinians until the eventual transfer, mass expulsion, i.e., can be accomplished. Both authors, Kimmerling and Reinhardt, both late, viewed the occupation, in this case politicide, as the single most important obstacle in the way of independence and liberation for the Palestinians. Its goal is to destroy the political and national existence for a whole community of people. The process is still ongoing, having included the invasions of 1967, 1976, 1982, the massacre of Jenin, 2002, 2006, and now the recent Gaza massacre of 2008-2009. Which involved the demolition of thousands of schools, mosques, hospitals, residential and commercial buildings, and United Nations facilities, and caused the death of more than 1,300 Palestinians, most of whom were civilians. The conventional wisdom in the U.S. and Israel is that the Israeli onslaught was a form of self-defense and retaliation for the lobbing of rockets by Hamas on Israeli settlements in southern Palestine. In fact, none of the destruction was exactly retaliatory for the feeble Qassam rockets or an exercise in self-defense. Rather, it was intended to break the Palestinian nation's spirit, to overwhelm its will to resist, to smother its aspirations for full independence, restitution, and a dignified existence. The Gaza massacres were not about Sderot rockets or breaking the ceasefire. They are but the latest phase of the ongoing war against the Palestinian people since 1948. The Palestinians refused to wither away, to forget their land and give up their rights, including the right to establish a sovereign, contiguous, and independent state. Hence, the use of overwhelming military power on the pretext that their democratically elected representatives are terrorists who inflict severe pain and suffering on Israeli settlers in Sderot and elsewhere. The use of overwhelming military power against predominantly Palestinian civilians is part and parcel of this politicide. Thus, the national aspirations of the Palestinians for full independence have been inhibited not only by military means, but also by diplomatic, and I emphasize diplomatic means, by bureaucratic means as well, by demographic policies, all of which are components of politicide. The single most important element of this politicide throughout these past 4 decades, I think, is diplomacy. American diplomacy has in recent years enabled Israel to achieve the goal of politicide by creating the illusion of two-state solution when that option has never been on Israel's real agenda. In fact, the real function of the peace process has been to shelter Israel from the threat of peace. The peace process has enabled Israel to escape its obligations to the Palestinian people under international law. Instead, such obligations have been effectively replaced by Israeli decrees presented as American peace initiatives. The second factor, since the inception of this so-called peace process, let's say back in 1969, Washington has been acting as peacemaker while at the same time it served as Israel's chief weapon supplier, bankroller, and diplomatic backer. But America's pretense for the role of honest broker is finished, in my opinion. It was conclusively finished in January 2006, and the reason was Hamas's electoral victory. The US and Israel are determined to undo that victory. They have been, first by the embargo and attempts at starvation, and by abducting the top Hamas leadership and smashing its infrastructure while attempting to drive a wedge between the movement and that segment of the Palestinian population which gave Hamas their votes. The crux of the US-Israel strategy is based on the faulty assumption that Hamas is part of the Middle East component of the bad guys. And there are a number of bad guys, as you know who they are: Iran and Syria and Hezbollah and Hamas and so on. The crux of the US-Israeli strategy is based on the faulty assumption that Hamas is part of the Middle East component of the bad guys engaged in global terror. Okay, the third factor is the Oslo process itself, the Oslo process, which started in 1993. In public, it seems that Oslo was supposed to usher in a two-state solution, but in fact, it was intended to accomplish two major objectives for Israel and the United States, even for Arafat. One was to eradicate the infrastructure of the First Intifada, to obliterate the emerging political and social culture of self-reliance, to do away with what some people referred to, going back to the Vietnam period, as parallel hierarchies, because that's what the First Intifada was all about, parallel hierarchies, making the occupation not only undesirable, but to make it unlivable and to make it impossible, and to create a counter for it, a substitute for it. So one was to obliterate the emerging political and social culture of self-reliance, to do away with the parallel hierarchies, a product of that culture which was aiming to render the 1967 occupation not only unacceptable, but also not possible. That culture, which emphasized people's power, which frowned on cronyism and rewarded merit, was also repugnant to Yasser Arafat and his establishment. The Intifada threatened to replace the old order with a new type of governance based on egalitarianism, meritocracy, and equal opportunity. Therein lay the interest of the three strange bedfellows, the US, Israel, and Arafat. Oslo was their common denominator, but unlike the Oslo envisioned by the Europeans who invented it, this has proven to be an arrangement which dealt a severe blow to this two-state option. Oslo's second real objective, I think, was buying time for Israel to continue its massive land grab under peaceful conditions. Oslo has also allowed the expansion of Jerusalem's satellites like Gilo, Ma'ale Adumim, and Jebel Abu Ghneim. Vast amounts of land were confiscated and thousands of people were dispossessed after the Oslo signing. In 1993, when Oslo was signed, there were 109,000 settlers in the West Bank, not including East Jerusalem. Today, that number is estimated to be 275,000 settlers living in 230 colonies. There are 625 checkpoints, representing 70% increase since the year 2005. Meanwhile, about 200,000 Jews are living in East Jerusalem today. Such a reality is so far away from the normalization which Israel seeks and the US endorses.
You are watching the Arabic Hours coverage of the conference One State for Palestine, Israel, a country for all its citizens. We'll be back with more after this program ID.
You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any of our previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
The combined design of the wall, Ma'ale Adumim, Jebel Abu Ghneim, Gilo, and the stealth takeover of the Hebron region have at least de facto, and de jure is not far behind, changed the definition of Jerusalem. Not long from now, the entire West Bank will probably, in some judicial way, be related to what is cleverly referred to as Greater Jerusalem. As we know, Jerusalem is the eternal capital of the Jewish state. Moreover, genuine independence had already been ruled out by an agreement between Labour and Likud in January 1997, which insisted on but a single sovereignty in the area between the river and the sea. I think this is a consensus in the Israeli state that there is no room for more than a single sovereignty, and that single sovereignty belongs to Israel. So you really can't have two independent states between the river and the sea. Okay, these, in my opinion, are the four impediments or obstacles in the way of a two-state option. Now, let me move into a current issue that is on the mind of many people, and that is, will this gloomy picture that I've put before you and that we're all aware of, will this gloomy picture change under President Obama? I have 14 pages here, which I'm trying to cut into 5. So, so far, okay, I have 7 minutes. Will Senator Mitchell restore the two-state option? Restore, quote unquote. Okay, we agreed that there was never an option. I think that no peace process will succeed unless there is a sharp break from the Clinton and Bush administration habit of acting as Israel's attorney, unconditional apologist, and defender, arms supplier, and financier. U.S. domestic politics is a double-edged sword. Irish Americans helped the Northern Ireland peace process by encouraging the U.S. to apply pressure on behalf of the weaker side, leveling the playing field for meaningful negotiations. The pro-Israel lobby, by contrast, has blocked peace by weighing the scales even more radically in favor of Israel. There can be no real negotiations when there is so much inequality of power and influence. I think that a real two-state solution and a real two-state option requires certain things. I will have time only to mention a few of them very quickly. One is a complete, rapid, and guaranteed end to the Israeli military occupation. I mean, that Israel would have to admit that there is an occupation, and occupation is a status under international law, and so that there has to be a complete, rapid, and guaranteed end to the Israeli occupation. Secondly, land occupied by Israeli settlers and settlements to be returned to Palestine. Number 3, the removal or integration of settlers into the Palestinian state, when and if this Palestinian state is established. Number 4, guaranteed free movement without Israeli interference between the West Bank and Gaza, and the full Palestinian control over airspace, water, land, electromagnetic spectrum, borders, immigration, commerce, etc. Number 5, it would also require full political and economic sovereignty and equality for the Palestinian people. But none of these requirements that I mentioned here, the 5 requirements, are in the offing. We might be left with the one-state solution. And I should emphasize that the one-state solution is not really to be chosen only because the other option has failed, but there are other inherent reasons why this is what is left. Within a few years, Palestinians will constitute the absolute majority in all the territories today controlled by Israel. Already, the prospects of a workable and durable two-state solution are doubtful. Ultimately, it must be admitted that the core of this conflict, like in Northern Ireland, is about lack of equality and a gross imbalance of power and rights, and any solution, whether based on one state or two, cannot work unless it guarantees equality. I think equality is perhaps the most important term here. Thank you very much.
You are watching the Arabic Hours coverage of the conference One State for Palestine, Israel, a country for all its citizens. We will continue our coverage after this brief program ID.